all working people is foundational to who we are. But in recent years, the question of police and their unions has raised a lot of questions. Is there something in the history or modern application of policing that makes them distinct from other workers in important ways?
So Shelley, thank you for having me on this, and I thank to Colin as well. This is a very central question that you're posing. And I would say, yes, there's something very distinct about law enforcement. But let me preface it by saying that, in my opinion, is that all workers should have the right to unionize, including soldiers. But that the fact of unionization does not put someone in the labor movement. It just means that they happen to be in organizations that are called unions and can collectively bargain. To me, there's a higher standard for being in the labor movement. And one of those is about solidarity. It's one of the reasons that for years, I frankly didn't consider much of the building trades in the labor movement because unions that openly excluded workers of color and women, I mean, where's the solidarity? There isn't. So I think that we need to distinguish between being in a union and being in the labor movement. The second thing is that law enforcement unions are the representatives of workers who are in the repressive apparatus of the capitalist state. That's not rhetoric, that's just reality. They're part of an institution that was created first and fundamentally to police and restrict slaves and to hunt down Indians. And then later to go after union activists. And then in some ways later than that to go after general criminals. And the guidance for law enforcement is first and foremost to protect property. So they have a very different role than most other workers who happen to be unionized. That said, I think that one of the things that has to happen in the movement is the kind of discussion that we're having tonight. And we've got to engage our members in a discussion about the role of law enforcement, because there are very different opinions within our own ranks about the role of law enforcement.
Very, very different. Okay, do you believe that police should have unions?
Yes, absolutely.
Why?
Because I believe that anyone that works should have a right to a union. When there's always a power imbalance between management and workers. And if workers do not have the right to unionize, there is a fundamental problem. So I believe that they should. What I don't agree with are collective bargaining agreements that are signed between law enforcement and governmental bodies that allow for officers of the law to get away with lawlessness, to not being targeted when they break the law. Things whereby their records are expunged after an incredibly short amount of time, when there's no other workers that I know of that have that kind of protection. So I think that there's real problems. There's complicity between many law enforcement unions and governmental bodies. And this is what drives me crazy when I hear, some of the discussions about law enforcement unions. It acts as if the governmental bodies are free and clear of any responsibility. It's as if the union imposed a contract on government. Yeah. And, I know a little bit about collective bargaining, and I have never come across a union that can impose a collective bargaining agreement on an employer. So that to me says that there's complicity on the part of governmental bodies that really want to just throw up their hands and say, oh, there's nothing we can do because there's this collective bargaining agreement. No, no, no. You signed the agreement. You knew what you were doing unless you were a fool. But you weren't a fool. You decided to go with this okie doke. So I think that there should be collective bargaining. I think that there should be unions. But I also think that law enforcement needs to be held accountable when it goes and engages in rogue operations, when it violates the rights of civilians. Because what we're talking about is that civilians want protection. They want stability. They don't want to fear that when they walk out that they're automatically going to be presumed to be guilty. Seems like the least that you can expect from a democracy, so-called.
Yeah, I know that is one of the challenges that we find in our area, where so often the city is silent almost on the actions of the police officers, and they will say, they'll leave it all at the feet of the union, when really no union makes their own contract, as much as we would like that. No union
Precisely.
makes its own contract. But
Right.
I
I mean,
do.
we're in a situation where we have been led to believe that the police and law enforcement generally are the only thing that stands in the way of barbarism.
Mhm,
Truth be told.
mhm,
I've been on a few juries. And what was interesting in one that I was in, actually two, that directly involved armed crime, that the judge asked anybody that, these weren't his words exactly, but anyone that believes that the word of the police should be accepted as fact,
mm.
please stand up. And there were a whole host of people that stood up.
Wow.
Now, some of them, I'm sure, just want to get out of jury duty, but others, right? I think that they really believe that if a cop says something, well, that's the way you
Yeah.
believe it, because they're the ones that stand between us and barbarism.
Yeah. And in fact, it's funny you say that, because there was a time I was called for jury duty, and they asked, "Do you believe this, or do you?" And I'm like, "Oh no, police officers are people. People tell
Right.
lies, so thus a police officer can tell a lie. So no, but so many folks did believe. Well, why would they lie? Why would they?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so next question is, should the union movement join forces with the Black Lives Matter movement and the cause for police accountability, and why? And I can tell you that the Black Lives Matter movement here in Rochester has sent a letter to the Labor Council to say, you should be saying or doing something different for police unions. So do you think that the the union movement should join forces with Black Lives Matter movement?
I think that it should absolutely join forces with the Black Lives Matter movement to demand a demilitarization of law enforcement, a reallocation of resources, a reassessment of what should be covered by policing, by armed policing, and what should be covered by other services. Um, I think that they should join together in issues of accountability. Um, my experience is that people want protection. There is no third force out there. There's no people's militia that's going to enter in and protect masses of people, unfortunately. But people pay taxes. They want to know that if they are faced with crime, that they will be protected as opposed to being treated as themselves criminals. And so I think that the joining with the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements, including the immigrant rights movements, is about democracy and it's about justice. It's about consistent democracy and consistent justice. And that's where the labor movement should stand, that we should be the ones that are saying, yes, consistent justice, that, that we should not have rogue law enforcement, whether it's ICE agents on the border or whether it's police in Rochester, that we should be demilitarizing the police so that when there is someone who is mentally or emotionally unstable, that the answer isn't a bullet in the head, right?
Or pepper spray in the face.
Or pepper spray in his face, that's right. That we need to rethink policing. And this is what I would argue that our central labor councils, our area labor federations, our state federations need to discuss. We need to get our members in a discussion about what we want from law enforcement and what does it mean to have law enforcement in a civilized society, and also to deal with the racial framework when we're looking at law enforcement. The fact that I, as a Black man, have to always, whenever I drive somewhere outside of a city, I have to look at the route to try to figure out places or directions that I can go where I'm least likely to be pulled over by the police. And I would challenge any white person that has ever had to worry about that.
For sure. Can you talk just a little bit more about the racial framework piece that you were talking about? How does that translate? Does that mean more training? Does that mean, what does that mean for police officers when you're talking about change in the racial framework?
It starts with that there is no war. Law enforcement, in part because they are carrying weapons, and in part because they actually deal with armed criminals, exist in an environment where they believe that there is a war, that they're in a constant state of war, as opposed to that they are serving the people. So one of the things that has to happen is a recognition that this is not a perpetual war, and that maybe, as happens in war situations, that if people get battle fatigue, you pull them out of action. If they can't distinguish right and wrong, if they can't distinguish a war environment from a non-war environment, maybe you pull them out of action and you put them somewhere else. Maybe they go into forestry or something.
Yeah.
And start cutting trees and serving the public in a different way.
Right.
So that's one of the things that needs to happen. Another thing is a real discussion in law enforcement about race. That you know, those of us of color cannot ever, and I would argue that not even Clarence Thomas can be race blind when he's dealing with law enforcement. That we know that there is a bias, that there are certain things that we have to do in order to protect ourselves. A friend of mine years ago from Los Angeles taught me certain basic lessons about dealing with the police, which actually became very important when I went to Northern Ireland and when British troops pulled rifles on me. And he said, when you're dealing with the police, everything that you do, you need to describe to them in advance. Right?
Yeah.
I am going into my bag and I am pulling out a tape recorder.
Yeah.
I am using my right hand to go for my keys. I'm going for this, right? All of these things that most white people would probably never think about.
Right.
Right. But for us, it's a matter of basic survival. This is part of the discussion that needs to happen. Another part is about when to, when, what was the kid's name in Ohio that was killed by the police? Rice, right? Tahir Rice?
Tamir.
Tamir Rice. When he was killed, I was thinking about when I was a kid in the Bronx. And a long time ago in New York, and I would play war with a lot of the other kids. And we had weapons. Obviously, they were plastic, they were fake, right? But we would play, and it was bang, bang, and all this other stuff. And I was thinking about this kid is playing with a toy gun, and the cops show up and automatically think that they have a right to kill him. That wouldn't happen in an Italian neighborhood. That just simply wouldn't. Let's be real. It would not happen in an Irish neighborhood. It would not happen in a Russian neighborhood. We know that. Let's stop BSing about it.
Yeah.
But it happened with a Black kid. And people say, well, we shouldn't be second guessing the cops. But we know if it happened with a white kid from a Russian neighborhood, people would be second guessing until the cows came home.
Right.
How do we know that? Because when a white woman in Minneapolis was killed unlawfully by the police because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, not only was that cop removed from the police department, but he was indicted and convicted. Only a few weeks after Philandro Castillo was killed by the police for legally possessing a gun.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the things that we've got to talk about, and it has to be a discussion with the police.
Yeah, for sure. They call it an adultification of children of color that police officers just seem to have, where they see children as adults when they are kids of color, and they treat them and approach them in that same manner, as if they're not children, and they don't have kid feelings and they don't have kid behaviors, but there's an adultification of Black and brown children that is very real. But we'll go on to another question.
No, but Shelley, we got to, we have to, we can't leave it there.
Okay.
It's important in terms of what you're raising to identify that we are the other, with a capital O.
Yes.
We are the scary ones.
Yes.
And we're the ones, in part because of slavery and the near annihilation of Native Americans. Most white people in this country really fear Black people and fear Indians. And part of what it is about this message that's been conveyed over and over again, that if we don't watch out, the Black folks and the Indians are going to do to us what we did to them. This is a message that goes throughout US history, and it enters into law enforcement. And since they have guns, then their fears can play themselves out in a very different way than just some white guy walking down the street who decides to be an ass, right? They have a gun. Right. And so this is, again, this is part of the discussion we have to have within the union movement and with law enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Locally and nationally, police unions have been highlighted as one of the central problems in preventing meaningful reform or even disciplining the particularly bad actors. Do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, absolutely. No question. Because what they do is that they take the narrowest interpretation of trade unionism and say that their job is to protect their members, right or wrong.
Right.
And that's what they do. And they basically look out for their members, and their members could have carried out any kind of crimes, and they'll come to their defense. And, maybe it starts off in a soft way saying, well, all the facts aren't in. Well, okay, right. And then maybe they go from there to go up with some level of justification. So the point is that they protect their members, and they look at that as being good trade unionism. And And I think that that's really problematic, because what's different is that these are supposed to be people serving the public. I mean, that is law enforcement is. And so the question that I think that all of these law enforcement unions need to address is not simply about the rights of their members, but are their members serving the public? You know, it's sort of like if you have a union, any kind of union, and you've got members that started throwing rocks at people of color or sexually harassing women. Well, you would want to make sure that they have whatever protection on a fundamental level that they're entitled to have by their contract. But that doesn't mean that you stand there and defend their actions.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you attempt to talk away what was done. Sure. I mean, just like getting a legal aid attorney, everyone has a right to a defense. But that doesn't mean an institution that theoretically should be advancing justice comes up with the most bogus claims to defend these activities.
Yeah. Yeah, we've had that discussion at our Labor Council meetings about whether or not there is a responsibility or an obligation to defend no matter what, or if we should say, that there's a standard of behavior and this is what we aspire to. And everyone understands, we're all union people, that there is such a thing as due process. But the rush to say what this person did nothing wrong before going through this due process, that there's a problem with that.
Exactly.
There's a problem with that. And I work with educational professionals, and on occasion we have some people in my field that don't always make the best choices.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't rush to say they did nothing wrong. What we say is there's a process and there's a procedure that we have to go through. There's an expectation that all of our members are going to operate at a certain level, at a certain standard. And if our person did that, then great. And if they did not do that, then we've got to deal with that. But there's not necessarily just that rush to say, oh, a person did nothing wrong, which seems to always be what happens for not
Almost
just
always.
the police union. Yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And which is also why we need civilian review of police activity. I mean, we just simply can't rely on them to self-police. That has been demonstrated time and again to not work, whether within the context of the law enforcement unions or law enforcement departments. There must be civilian oversight and penalties.
And penalties
Mm-hmm.
with T.
Yeah.
Political leaders locally and across the country have made the case repeatedly that it is impossible for them to fire bad actors in the public sector. Is this true?
No. It's as someone who has done a lot of representational work in the public sector, I get sick and tired of hearing this whole notion that we can't discipline people. What the union, the position of the union is always, if you're going to discipline, then you discipline, but you make sure that you have your ducks in a row, right? And that you make sure that things are documented. So it's not about whether the police can't be disciplined. That's absurd. What it is that if you're going to do it, you do it the right way and you get the documentation. Now, what happens in my experience, and not just in the public sector, is that many employers are very bad about documenting until they've decided that they want to go after a particular person. And that's when they document. But there might be other people who are really messing up in their work and there's no documentation. So then when something onerous is done, you don't have any record, right? And you say, well, we can't fire them because there's nothing in their record. Well, that's the responsibility of the employer. And my feeling has always been that you go after the employer on that. So no, when people make the argument that there's nothing that can be done, that's sophistry. I mean, the case is that something can always be done. The question is whether there's political will. And in many of the governmental authorities, if not most, there is no political will.
So why do you think they make their claims so consistently?
Oh, because they don't want people coming after them.
They'd rather people go
It's
after.
much easier. Yeah, it's much easier to point the blame at the police unions and say, hey, there's nothing we can do, right? As if, again, the contract was imposed upon them. But it wasn't. So, and you know, or if they say, well, you know, if there'll be some sort of public sector review of what, well, yeah, okay, so you get your facts in a row. You get everything in order. But it's a way of avoiding taking any responsibility. That's really what's going on. And that's why we have to hold the law enforcement unions and the law enforcement authorities, the governmental bodies, responsible for these travesties that we find ourselves in.
Do you think it's a low-key way of trying to create anti-union sentiment in communities?
In some cases, it is. I've actually read things where right-wingers have said that the problems with the police departments are not about race, it's about unions. And we've got to get rid of police unions and we've got to get rid of public sector unions. So I've heard that. We've got to be very careful about that. But more than anything, it's really about avoiding blame by governmental bodies, of acting as if they really would like to do something, but they can't. Sort of like something I experienced with building trades, in the building trades industry, where you would have, and still do, incredible racial and gender discrimination. So you'd go to the company, contractor, and say, why aren't you bringing on more workers of color and more women? They'd say, we'd love to. Problem is the union. Then you go to the union, and the union, you say, well, why aren't there more workers of color? They say, hey, we don't hire the workers, the company hires them. And you start feeling like you're on a merry-go-round, right? And you're not getting any answer because both sides are complicit in a particular racist and sexist practice. And we have to call it out.
Okay, and the last question I had for you is the being critical does being critical of police unions begin that slippery slide into attacking other public sector unions? You know, the arguments that are used, police unions hamper improving performance, public sector unions drive up costs and drive up taxes. If we as a labor movement start attacking or being critical, not attacking, being critical of police unions, are we setting up teacher unions, state workers? Are we
No.
doing more harm than good by doing that?
No, we're not. So I'm going to make an unapologetic plug for my book, They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions, that has a discussion about these issues of the attacks on the public sector. And then I will say that, no, being critical of law enforcement unions, you notice I use law enforcement, not just police. Law enforcement unions is not an attack on unions. Unions that screw up, whether they're in law enforcement, the building trades, the public sector, need to be criticized. Being critical is not the same thing as attacking or demanding the removal. So I'm going back full circle. I'm not in favor of getting rid of any unions, right? I'm not in favor of any laws that are being passed or that people are attempting to pass to remove the right of unionization, because I believe that once you start going down that road,
Mhm.
there is no end in sight, because it goes from, okay, police can't have unions, to firefighters can't have unions, to teachers can't have unions, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that the fundamental thing is that there has to be accountability. And,
Mhm.
you know, one of the things that you haven't asked Shelley, but I'll lay this out, is that law enforcement unions don't understand what solidarity is. They really don't. They demand it from the rest of us, but they don't give it. And therefore, I think we should tell them that it would be better if they all went into their own union, right? That all law enforcement should go in and be some sort of overall law enforcement union. So all the law enforcement in AFSCME and SEIU, they should all go into another union. And I think everyone will be much better off, because
Mhm.
these law enforcement units overall are they exist as an anchor on a ship that's trying to go out to sea, that keeps hugging the bottom of the harbor and restricting our ability to move. They have a right to
Mhm.
unionize. They should go off on their own and do that. But I think that needs to be part of a discussion. And I obviously know that there'll be people in AFSCME and SEIU that'll be furious and think I'm nuts for raising this, and say, well, how can you do that, right? And think about what it's going to do to our dues, the per
Yeah,
capita coming
membership,
in.
yeah.
And I look at, that's a personal problem. That's something you guys got to figure out. But I think that at the level of both structure and mission of our movement, at a point in time when we need a movement that is thinking about social justice, that's thinking about the reconstruction of the United States, we do not need an anchor that is preventing us from leaving the harbor.
Thank you. Wow. Okay, Shelley's asked most of her questions. Now she's going to step away from the mic and give other people the opportunity to ask questions too. So if you are interested in asking a question, I'm going to ask that you raise your hands. I see Jim Bertolone and Nathan Hetherington are going to be up first and second.
And we have
And
some in the chat, by the way.
And then we'll go to, okay, then why don't we go, we'll do Jim, chat, Nathan, chat. How's that?
Thanks,
Okay,
Shelley.
absolutely.
Welcome, Brother Bill.
Thank you.
I read your book on the bankruptcy of the rights philosophy. Everyone should read it. Shortly after the George Floyd, a little over a year ago, you wrote an article, I think it was published in The Nation, about why we should keep police unions in the AFL-CIO. Am I correct? Either
It was,
The Nation
no,
or in
it
these
was,
times, maybe?
yeah, it was in these times, and it wasn't about why to keep them in. It's about what is the debate that we need to have,
Right.
right? So I was arguing that the principal debate now is not whether or not to keep the unions in, the law enforcement unions in. The key debate is about what is the role of law enforcement in a civilized society in the 21st century, and what does that mean for the union movement? So I was opposing people who thought that you do the easy route of just passing resolutions to get rid of the law enforcement unions.
Well, the two things that I wanted to mention. One that's come up repeatedly in our meetings. Most unions, mine is in the private sector, have what we call a duty of fair representation. And like you said, all management has the right to discipline and fire. I've been an arbitration advocate for over 30 years. Our job is to make sure that they meet their burden of proof, due process. It's not to protect everybody's job. And it's
Mhm.
also to tell our members when they meet their burden of proof on lesser discipline, that if they don't straighten out, they're going to be fired.
Mhm.
You got to straighten out. But the thing that bothers me about blaming the police union themselves, and when you hear the head of the police union in New York City open his mouth, or the guy in Minneapolis, you can understand why. But it's as you said previously, we need to hold the politicians and the bosses accountable. You have a history of them not wanting to raise taxes. So you have a history of negotiations where they get the union to buy lower and lower raises in return for giving the unions more and more power.
Mhm.
And then they want to throw their hands up and say, it's not my fault. We had about 10 days ago a commission that went on for months on race, and policing was one of this. The city and the county still hasn't posted it. I happen to know what's in it because I know one of the co-chairs, and I know the recommendations I made on policing. But it's like what we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement when individual officers went rogue and beat somebody up. That's a bad cop. That's a racist cop. When a whole police force did it, they were told to clear the streets by any means necessary, and that was a mayor or a police chief who did that. And when they're clubbing everybody and all the cops are doing it, and we've seen this over and over. Daniel Cruz. It took like 8 months for police management and the mayor to issue an order that when you have a suspect in custody, you can't put your weight on their back, head, or neck because they can't breathe. You got the handcuffs on them, they're unarmed. You can't do it because they keep dying. You know, how long does it take to issue that order? It took 2 months after a little girl was pepper sprayed before they came out with an order saying you can't use pepper spray on a child. And I think the other thing that we miss sometimes with the police is our criminal justice system. We've got to do something about juries that no matter what, or grand juries, no matter what cops do, don't indict. DAs, like we saw with Brianna, who don't bring all the evidence so nobody gets indicted. We just had today a report in City newspaper, an African-American guy who went to prison in 1969, part of the Black Panthers. 50 years he did. He gets out on parole. In his parole package, it's included a form to register to vote. Not knowing he has to get the okay from the state government, he sends in the registration. They disapprove it. They violate him parole, try to send him to prison for life. And Sandy Dorley, our DA, says in today's paper, well, registering to vote improperly, it's not a major thing. Why did she take it to a grand jury and looking for an indictment to imprison this guy for life? I mean, the police union is one thing, but the police union is not generally the attorney in the criminal justice case or presenting the case to a grand jury. And these guys are getting off from prison time in our criminal justice system, not in the collective bargaining forum.
Mhm.
That's
Okay.
just my comment. And I wanted to know what you thought about that.
Well, I mean, there was a lot there that you were laying out. And so I'm really not sure where to begin. I'm just going to treat that as a comment that you raise and keep the discussion moving.
Okay. Okay. In the chat, there's a question. Are there any police represented on this Zoom call? So if there are, could you please just raise your hand in the reactions? And then I'll go to the next question, which was, Bill, what is your position on police abolition? And Nathan, you're next up, okay? So Bill, what is your position on police abolition? And then I'll count the hands up for police officers in the room.
There's no country on this planet, to my knowledge, that has no police. So it ain't gonna happen. And I think that using, I understand why the slogan was raised. But what's really interesting is how poorly that slogan does in communities of color. And so I think that the reality is that people want accountable protection. And I think we have to be in favor of accountable, demilitarized protection. And that's what I would focus on, rather than slogans. I understand what motivated the slogans, and I understand the fury with the police, which I have felt, having been stopped by the police and threatened. I understand it, I get it. But at the political level, I think we've got to talk about what people are demanding.
Mm. Okay, thank you. Nathan?
Sorry, I have my kids downstairs and they're making a lot of noise.
Okay.
Okay.
So I have a question. Wow, I am shaking up and down here. Give me a second, sorry. So as a delegate, I'm trying to figure out how to weave a path between a very vocal group of members who want nothing to do with any organization that is involved with the police right now, and less vocal members who I know full well will become incredibly vocal if we are to separate ourselves from the police or from police unions, or if the Labor Council were to do so, if we were to come out, if as a union we were to come out strongly against police union involvement in any organization that includes the police union. Do you have, I've never been someone who shied away from asking those wiser than myself a question I don't quite have an answer for. Do you have any suggestions on how to walk that line?
Yeah. See, I think that the issue is for the union movement, the most important issue is not whether there are police unions in our area labor federation, central labor councils or whatever, or even within our parent body. I don't think that's the main question. I think the main question is, what is the stand of our unions on police brutality and police injustice? That's the main question. Because you can do whatever you want, passing resolutions and expelling this union or that union. At the end of the day, the question is, where does the union stand on injustice? Where does the union movement stand on skilled trade unions that will not allow women in? Right? That's the question. Where does the union movement stand on unions that have blocked the entrance of workers of color? Right? Those are the questions, right? I mean, it's like we're taking a stand on, we should be looking at what's going on with the police unions in a larger context. There is a lot of unevenness in the labor movement. I, for one, as someone who's focused for years on the desegregation of the building trades, I'm actually been more furious at things that have gone on in the building trades than in law enforcement. But the critical thing for us as a movement is, where do we stand on the activities of law enforcement? When George Floyd was murdered, where do we stand on that? And do we stand with the movement that arose in response? or not? Do we remain silent? You know, when Castile was killed, do we stand with his family or do we take a pass? Right? You know, do we engage in these struggles around justice or do we just pass a resolution? That's what I think is most important. And so for your members, Nathan, you know, people are going to have different positions and the union may not, your union may not be able to agree on the outcome of what should happen to police unions, whether you should work with them. I would say what I would want to know more is what is your union doing about examples of police brutality? What happened when that guy in Rochester was killed, right? Where was your union? That's all I want to know. I care less about whether you're saying throw the union out of the Area Labor Federation. When there are these injustices, where do people stand? Which side are they on? That's the question. And I think one of the things that you'll find is that some people that are not in favor of throwing police unions out are nevertheless going to be on the right side of what needs to be done about police injustice. And those are the people that we need. So we've got to always frame the debate in a way that is clear and is useful. And a lot of the discussions I would argue about whether to throw the police unions out really miss the larger point. We really need to be talking about policing. We need to be talking about law enforcement and what we want from this society. Do we want cops killing people for selling unregistered cigarettes? Do we want cops killing people because they're mentally or emotionally unstable? Do we want cops killing kids for playing with toy weapons? Right? To me, those are the questions. And where does the union movement stand on making sure that that doesn't happen and that cops that do that get penalized? That's what we should be focusing on.
Thank you. Okay, I said I would go to a chat and you actually already answered one of the questions in the chat. Should police unions be part of the AFL-CIO and the broader labor movement? So you've kind of already answered that question. Did you want to say anything more about that?
No, just that we should, it's not about just passing resolutions. In Seattle, the King County Labor Council, they passed a resolution to get rid of a police union. But they passed and it was a very slim majority. The question to me is, okay, now what?
Right.
What are you going to do?
Right.
Right, so you passed the resolution. Now what?
Yeah, now what? Right. Now what? It's time to act now. Lisa, you're up next.
Bill, he answered my question.
Okay.
I was saying, you know, there was talk about, you know, removing the police from our labor union or labor movement. And my question was, well, could it might make them stronger? But then in saying that, it's not a question really of removing them, but holding all the other unions as to a higher standard. Are we going to be willing to accept those actions from that police, the locust club per se?
So I don't think that it makes them stronger. And I noticed one of the comments in the chat challenged me on my reference to the police being an anchor holding the ship from going out to sea. And I appreciate their point. I just disagree. Law enforcement unions or law enforcement segments of unions tend to be the most conservative within the unions and hold the unions back from much when it comes to social justice. I guess what I'm saying, Lisa, is that giving them the right to unionize, supporting them in their right to unionize, but in a different environment, gives us less of a constraint, but respects their right to organize.
Could
yes,
could you expand on what you mean by gives us more or less of a constraint?
yeah, because I mean, I have been in situations where unions and federations have refused to take certain stands because of law enforcement,
Mm.
whether around immigration or around policing or around Leonard Peltier and whether he should be released from prison,
Mhm.
right? Because the law enforcement units, no matter how small they were raising hell and saying no. And so that's what I mean by an anchor,
Mm.
holding the ship from going out to the ocean. Now, are there examples of solidarity? I'm sure that there are. I've never encountered any. I was thrown across a picket line by some cops because I was trying to convince some scabs not to scab. So my attitude was, I guess that those police didn't really appreciate solidarity. I haven't seen, I'm sure that it exists. I'm sure that because this is not individual. I'm sure that, I mean, there are people in law enforcement that I know personally that are good people.
Right, right.
This is not an indictment of every individual law enforcement person. We're talking about institutions
yeah.
and the way that institutions operate.
Right. Right. I will, thank you. Thank you for your question, Lisa, and your answer, Bill. We've got one person who in the room who is retired law enforcement. So to answer your question that was posed earlier. Okay, I have another question and from the Google Doc, from the anonymous Google Doc. There are times where it feels like the police are telling us what we want in terms of protection. What can we do to require police to do their job in the way that we feel we need? And then as a follow-up, what role does the police union have in reframing the conversation, even when it may reduce their force or reduce their pay?
Wow, good questions. So I would say that one of the ways that we reframe the discussion has to do with the people that we run for office, the kind of political leadership that we support, encourage, nurture, and the platforms that they run on. And the platforms that they run on, particularly in light of what we've been seeing in the last several years, needs to deal with the issue of law enforcement and accountability. And it needs to deal with what we mean by policing. So one of the discussions that needs to happen really is, what are the activities that necessitate someone showing up with a gun? And what are the activities that we need from government where there are stressful situations that are not going to be helped by someone having a gun? That needs to be part of a political discussion. That should be a discussion in city councils, in county councils, in state legislatures. And that means that we need to be running people for office that are advancing a different view about the role of law enforcement. We need to have people that are running that say, for instance, that we should not be putting kids in cages because they happen to be immigrants. And that needs to be part of our stand. Now, the issue of where the law enforcement unions come in this is very complicated, because to the extent to which those law enforcement unions see themselves as protecting their members, as opposed to articulating a vision of law enforcement, they're going to be very conservative. They're not going to be fundamentally challenging the system. In some cases, they will actively intervene in the political arena, however, as we saw in 2016 and 2020, when a number of these folks ended up backing Trump, and and saw Trump as a great defender of law enforcement. And so, excuse me, that tells us something. It tells us which side they're on, which is another reason I think that they should be in their own outfits, and not be an anchor on us moving out to the ocean.
Okay, I have another question in the chat. Numerous studies and FBI investigations have indicated a worsening white supremacist problem within police departments.
Mhm.
How do we balance the need for a full and thoughtful discussion with the threat of organized fascist infiltration?
We began a movement to have Bill Fletcher do racial justice trainings for all law enforcement authorities. And I guarantee you, I'll give you the good housekeeping seal of approval on that. Now, beyond that, but in all seriousness, see, here's the problem. The US military, despite its weaknesses, has been much better than law enforcement authorities in identifying fascists.
Mhm.
And of either kicking them out of the military or preventing them from coming in. And they haven't been perfect by any stretch of the imagination, which became absolutely clear on January 6th. But they've been better than law enforcement. Law enforcement at the local level is basically turns a blind eye towards these fascists. And either they are simply unaware, or in some cases they're complicit. I'm reminded of the great Costa Gavras film Z, about the circumstances leading up to the Greek coup in 1967 by the military, and about the penetration in the police by the fascists. There is, among a certain element of fascists, not all, because there's another wing of fascists that hate the police, interestingly, but there is a part of the kind of fascist, right-wing populist moves out there that see themselves as an auxiliary to law enforcement. They see themselves as assisting law enforcement. And I think that we saw, case in point being what happened with the killing in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And so you don't have in enough of these law enforcement outfits any kind of agency to really scrutinize the applicants and make sure that fascists don't enter in. I mentioned that there's also another wing of fascists that are very anti-police. And these are people that are basically preparing for Armageddon. And they see all representatives of the government, which they often refer to as ZOG, the Zionist occupation government, a government controlled in their mind by Jews. They see them as the opposition, and therefore they're prepared to go after the police. But you've got both of these wings of the fascists. And so the local authorities are very blind to this element and don't see them as a threat. They see the left as a threat. And we saw that in the January 6th coup attempt with the arguments made by many of the Republicans, including that dimwit out of Wisconsin, the senator who basically said that these were good Americans and that he would have been more worried if it had been Black Lives Matter or Antifa folks. But it wasn't Black Lives Matter and it wasn't Antifa folks that were attacking the Capitol and threatening Vice President Pence, as well as others. It were fascists. And so, but you have this level of sympathy within many law enforcement authorities. And I think that this is something that we need government to take up. We need to be actively purging law enforcement of fascists. We need to be hunting them down and putting them under the jail.
Okay. We're gonna go to Marvin and then the chat and then Dan.
Oh, Shelley, let me just answer this. I got to. Someone wants to
Okay.
know,
Okay,
do I hate cops?
Okay.
No, I hate what police often do. I hate the fact that I am scared to death anytime a police car pulls up behind me, whether its lights are on or not. I hate the fact that there are certain neighborhoods that I can't go into without being afraid that I will be pulled over and possibly killed. I hate that. I hate the fact that a little black kid would be killed by the cops for playing with a gun, the kind of gun that I played with once upon a time. I hate the way policing dehumanizes cops. That I know good people that have gotten into law enforcement and have lost their humanity as a result. And they were good people. That's what I hate. And I hate that anyone of color is presumed guilty in the United States, no matter what they do, what they don't do, where they are, where they're not. We're always presumed guilty. I hate the fact that anytime there is a crime, one of the first things that I have to do is pray that the person was not African American, was not an Arab, was not a Latino or Latina, wasn't an Indian. That's what I hate.
Thank you. You're not alone in that feeling and hating that feeling. That
Thank you.
thing in your gut. You're not alone. Marvin?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm in the car, so got to go down here to get my second shot vaccine, and I've been listening very attentively to everything. Bill did a great job on the last Zoom call, and just whatever I guess I can answer as far as a question. That's what I'm here for.
Thank you.
Okay, Dan Maloney?
Hey, hello again, Bill.
Hey,
All right, thanks for coming out to play one more time.
pleasure.
All right.
Absolutely.
So again, I think when you were talking about don't be against, the police union itself, but let's be against brutality. I think we're already all there. So it's a matter of what changes do you see specifically that would help in the training, the hiring practices, the appropriate level of police staffing, right? Those are the things that I believe we're looking for is the actual, what can we get behind, implement and to help the situation out. But there'll be nobody on this call. I don't think you'll find a cop that says, yep, we're in favor of brutality. And by the way, in the old days, some were, right? And I'll tell you a personal story of mine, walking down the street as a little kid, and we used to walk in groups going to school. And my brother was talking pig this, pig that. One of the kids, daddy was a cop. Next day he rolls up in the squad car and jacks my brother up, feet off the ground against the tree, shaking him. Don't you ever call me up, whatever, going off on him. He didn't care who was watching in front of God and country, put the fear in everybody that was watching. That's what he wanted. That's what he was after. Mazio knows a cop. He was motorcycle cop back in the 60s. I think it was still on the force when Mazio started. So yeah, there's always been wing nuts, right? People that are out of control, ought not have been hired, needed some different training. But what can we do today, right, to fix the problem? What can we go after?
So this is a great question, Dan. One thing I would start with is demilitarization. I think cops should not look like they're on the streets of Kabul. I don't think we should be having tanks and automatic weapons. I don't want to look at our police and law enforcement as if they're from Blackwater or whatever Blackwater calls itself these days. So part of the thing, and it's not just about image, it's about the mentality. You know, it's like when they say, if you're a hammer, everything is a nail. If you've got tanks and AR-15s, everything is a war. So part of what we have to do is we have to move towards demilitarization. The second thing is, and this is not in order of importance though, the second thing is the thing I was raising before about distinguishing what needs to be dealt with by policing and what needs to be dealt with by social work. And unless we're going to arm social workers or we're going to train police in social work, right? We're going to have to distinguish those kind of activities. When one of these recent brutality cases where there was an argument going on between two people, the police show up, it was a family argument, the guy goes to his car and gets shot. I mean, there was an argument going on in the family. Nobody said that such and such had an AR-15 or something. So we've got to change the mentality through which we're looking at problems. So that's a second thing. The third thing, which is related to both race and the issue of the fascists, is that there really need to be serious internal education programs for all incoming police, and then periodically on. So it's not like a smallpox vaccination, you get it once and that's it. This is going to be more like the COVID vaccines that we're probably going to have for the rest of our lives, right? That you're going to periodically have discussions about issues of race and issues of these fascists, et cetera, that have to enter in. We have to have civilian oversight. There has to be. You can't leave oversight to the people who are responsible for this. It's called subjectivity, right? People are subjective. If you ask me to evaluate myself, I will tell you I am one of the greatest people that's arrived on planet Earth, right? Now, my wife and other people may have a different position, right? It's called objectivity. And that's the attitude that we have to take towards issue of law enforcement. So those are some of the things that we have to take up. And this means that the union movement needs to be very clear. I mean, I hear what you're saying about the police don't say that they're in favor of brutality. Okay, so we need all police unions to make it very clear publicly that they are against all forms of rogue police activity, all forms. That the police unions are not endorsing rogue police activity and brutality, that they exist to serve, and that they stand with the community in those concerns. I'd like to see all the police unions around the United States move those resolutions. I'd just like to see it, see where that happened, right? And they need to take these steps. And then we need to make sure that the governmental bodies ensure that it happens. So I think that there's things that absolutely can be done. and that our movement needs to take a very firm stand around this.
Absolutely.
There was
Absolutely.
a,
And that's, oh, I'm sorry.
Shelley, yeah, there was a program Bill Stevenson used to belong to. I think Denise Young will know it well, PACTAC, Police and Citizens Together Against Crime. And they used to walk a beat with a cop, citizens, right? And I think that's a costly program because you need more cops. It's slow to develop those relationships, walk into those stores in the neighborhood, meet people on their front porches, and get that humanitarian, a face, a handshake, make that bond again. And it's a costly thing. And I don't think anybody wants to spend the money anymore to do the kind of policing that would work, in my opinion. So just to get your thoughts on that.
We need neighborhood associations. That's what we need. And we need the union movement to be building neighborhood associations. We need people to interact with each other much more, watching out for each other, watching out for who's coming into the neighborhoods and who's not, who has not picked up their mail and who has, who may need, food assistance. We need to rebuild a sense of community. There's many places where folks aren't going to want the cops there. The level of distrust is much too great, at least in the immediate. But they do want protection, and they do want to know what's going on in their communities. The Packing House Workers Union in the old days helped to organize neighborhood associations. The Teamsters in St. Louis did exactly the same thing. Maybe your area labor federation should start working with other community-based groups to start building neighborhood associations as part of rebuilding community. And that could ultimately address the issue of policing.
Absolutely. In our office, we have a saying that it's all about relationships. That everything begins and ends with the relationships that you build or don't build.
Right.
That you invest in and don't invest in. Bob Beckwith, Denise Young, and then Ms. B.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned that you're supportive of civilian review boards, which in Rochester would be the Police Accountability Board. And as you know, that unions and prior to unions, people have fought hard battles to establish due process in the disciplinary process. And, it's standard that unions don't back down from due process, that is the greatest right we give people. They pay dues. And if we were to support holding back on due process, we don't know what would happen after that. I mean, now we're talking about police accountability boards. Who knows? It could be state worker accountability board or teacher accountability board. How do you stand with that? Because I see a conflict. I understand the position of that you mentioned you can't leave the same people to decide things, but in true due process, you have arbitrators to make determinations. And with police discipline, at least in Rochester, their due process is even less, at least as I see it. And I'm somebody who represents state workers in arbitrations. At the end of the day, an arbitrator makes a decision, and then the manager says whether they agree or disagree with it. And I don't know, but I would be surprised if the manager ever went with less than what the neutral did. So how do you, kind of balance those things about, having a police accountability board? How does that weigh in with unions working for hundreds of years, a couple hundred years, trying to get due process for their members?
I appreciate this question because, due process is fundamental. I'm not one who believes that an allegation equals the truth. An allegation is an allegation. So I believe that a case needs to be developed against somebody. And it's not enough to just say that someone did something. So I believe that.
Sure.
The problem is that the relationship between the police unions and their bosses is incestuous. And so the problem of, yeah, I don't know if you've run across this, but one of the things I've run across with a number of with arbitrators is that when arbitrators get used to working with the same groups, they don't necessarily want to do certain things that are going to really rock the boat because they want to be called back again.
Mhm.
And so that introduces a certain kind of subjectivity that I get nervous about. The issue of civilian oversight is basically saying that we need something outside of the relationship between management and the union within law enforcement that can actually look at a situation with a different pair of glasses. And I think that that's very different than other parts of the public sector. Because the other thing is that the other parts of the public sector don't have guns. So the ramifications are much greater when we're dealing with law enforcement. So I agree with you on the issue of due process. I'm not in favor of witch hunts. I'm not in favor of an allegation equals the truth. But I think that we have to have a system that steps back a little bit and introduces greater objectivity.
Sure, I can't.
Oh, okay, next up is Denise Young and then Ms. B.
Hi, Bill.
Hey,
I several of the kind of themes that we've been rattling around with the last couple of moments really resonate with me. But one of the big things that I wanted to figure out how we can follow up on is the critical importance of white trade unionists taking substantive, solid, concrete movement to not just stand in solidarity. Lots of folks I know have expressed their support and have been present at Black Lives Matter stuff locally, and if in fact nationally, supports CBTU and a variety of other forms. But the question here is so much deeper and so much more profound in a sense. Everything that it seems like we've been talking about goes back to the root question of structural racism and white supremacy. I mean, the painful but so true answer that you gave, Bill, to the question of do you hate police, the description that all of us have heard from our friends of color about having the talk with their particularly young sons of color, white trade unionists have to figure out, we have to figure out how to really make manifest our support and begin this long, I'm afraid it's going to be long, process of deep change on this. I'm thinking back to a lot of episodes in the farm worker community when ICE, for example, would position themselves in cars outside of rural Catholic churches after Mass would let out and scoop up undocumented workers. And people of, quote, conscience from the religious community or whatever came to their defense. I don't ever remember seeing any presence from the labor movement in any of these episodes that happened over and over and over again in our region for years. I just think that we have to put ourselves in timeout, if you will, for a few bits of time and figure out what is our response. What do we need to be doing? What kind of dialogue do we have to have with our members and with the other labor bodies, community organizations, whatever, that we have influence with? That getting hung up on the question, a lot of us have known Mike Mazzio, head of the Locust Club here for years, have had a variety of wonderful interactions with Mike on some questions. That is not in any way what the issue is. The Labor Council here, I'm seeing my internet connection is unstable. Sorry about that. The question that we have to drill down on is, where are we on police brutality? Why is it all right for 6 adults to be witnesses to the pepper spraying of a 9-year-old child? And we can go on and on with all of these episodes, but the clarity of the need for struggle on social justice on these questions couldn't be clearer. And I think that we have got to find the ways and the forums to have these conversations with each other and begin to honestly describe and move the thinking and consciousness of our members and ourselves on these questions.
So the good news is that in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, the protests and uprisings that took place were the most multiracial that anyone can remember in US history. And that you actually had large numbers of whites that decided it was time to stand up and say no to police brutality. So that's the good news. Within the trade union movement, the story is a little bit much more of a mixed bag. That many unions passed decent resolutions, but the problem was that their failure to have conducted real internal discussions about race resulted in pushback, and in some cases to reversals in resolutions because there was right-wing pushback within the ranks. And so what we learned from that is that this is, again, not a one-time inoculation, that there's an ongoing discussion that needs to take place. And not enough of our leaders are courageous enough. I don't know whether the last time when we had our educational, whether I raised this, but I was really struck a few months ago, shortly after the January 6th coup attempt. I was talking with, I was on a call with about 10, 15 local union leaders in the West Coast. And they were in a complete panic. They didn't know how to understand what they had seen happen on January 6th. They didn't know how to talk with their members. They were hearing right-wing members of their unions talking, and some of them were ready to jump out of the plane and pull the ripcord. They were basically more worried about losing their right-wing members than they were about losing the rest of us. And some of them were going in the direction of, well, maybe we've gone too far. Maybe we need to go back to our core issues of wages, hours, and working conditions. And that was completely missing the boat. It was because we've stayed so restricted that we're in the trouble that we are in. So I think that we need leadership that is courageous enough to have the kind of discussions that we're having tonight. The other thing that we need to do is to get members when they first join. We really, part of the new worker orientation, new union member orientation, needs to include real discussions about race and gender, and what we mean by solidarity. That usually doesn't happen. We might talk about the contract and this and that, and what steward to call, and maybe a rep, but we don't really talk in any depth about solidarity. And when you factor in that overwhelmingly people are going into unions now who have no idea what a union is, we've got to be doing some really basic education, but we've got to expand what it is. So that's the duty. And that's part of it. The other part is to take on these issues when they come up, that the area labor federation, your central labor councils, the state feds needs to be out there speaking out very concretely about these injustices, and not just passing a resolution and not just expressing sympathy.
Yeah, one of the really frustrating parts of this for me has been, for me personally, has been the reluctance to have those courageous conversations, and the reluctance for leaders of different unions to come together to have those conversations. One of the things that still baffles to this day is, people say we're against police brutality, but there's been no statement, no public statement from the agencies that say, we don't believe in this, we don't stand for this. So it's like, yeah, well, of course we're against police brutality, but no one says it out loud to anyone.
Right. Right.
And again, in our council and in our ALF, people aren't willing to have those conversations, and we get stuck.
Right.
And some of us get frustrated. I'm sorry, Ms. B, and then Jim, is your hand up for a second time, or is that the leftover from the first time?
Yeah, no, it's second time. So if you want to go to Marge first, I don't think
Okay.
you've spoken yet.
Okay, Ms. B. You're on mute.
Good evening, and I apologize because I was on an earlier Zoom and I came on late, and then I had to change my computer because my connection was weak. So I don't know what went on earlier, but I listened to you, Bill, and I appreciate your knowledge, and I've watched you at least a couple of times prior to this. And but I got disturbed. I got frustrated, in other words, a little bit when I heard you talk, really being stereotypical when you talked about your situation as a younger person in whatever, because I lived that as well. I have two sons, had two sons, a decade apart, and they experienced the exact same experience. Nothing changed in 11 years between them. Nothing changed. But for them, they didn't stereotype. I heard what you said. I got on soon enough to hear that part where you were afraid of this and afraid of that. And you felt anytime you saw a police officer, how you felt about them. Well, my youngest son felt like, because of the way he was treated and he knew how his older brother was treated, he felt like he wanted to make a difference. He didn't just want to look at police officers. And I agree with what was in the chat. It sounded like you hated police, cops. I'm going to say cops. All police officers aren't bad. And when we say, and I agree with Shelley and officers, we don't want to see any brutality. And when we say police, and I heard you say police officers, the whole force isn't bad. And I heard you say that as well. A couple of times, there are some good people. But when we label the whole group, that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing. We need them as well. We need them as well. We have to do something. We have to come together as a union, as unions, to try to come together. And you are that knowledgeable, a knowledgeable person, one of the knowledgeable people that we need to have at the table to help us bring the unions together to see how to fix this, not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to know how to fix this. We're not trying to say that we need police officers. Like you said, there isn't a country that you know that doesn't have police officers. So we can't say we don't need them, because first, anytime something happens, who are we going to call? We're going to call the police, 911. So we're not trying to make it worse for ourselves. The sad part about it is that we know, I'm thinking about January 6th, every kind of force there was, from the armed forces to, I'm telling you, there was KKK that was in all of those things that had some kind of uniform on, that had their rifles and their guns and every kind of weapon you could think of that was out there in Washington. But they were licensed to have those things. We have all of those in our police officers, and they were happy to become those legal people to do the job. We have all those people in our police force and happy to carry those weapons because they're legally able to do it. But that's only a choice few that's doing that. We can't blame the total police force for what's happening to our children and to our people of color and to other people as well, because we still need them. But we need to be able somehow to have educated people like you, Bill Fletcher. I agree with 90% of what you're saying, but you do sound like you hate cops. And that's my opinion. My opinion is mine. I've enjoyed listening to you, and I will continue to listen to you. But tonight, you really stereotyped. And I'm saying there is another way. You can help us with all that you. Thank you.
So I appreciate that. I answered that question, and I would answer it the same way again if I was asked. my attitude towards the police when I was in Northern Ireland in 1988, I saw the way the British troops treated the Catholic community. I had AR-15s pointed at me. I was pulled out of a car. Never had this happen before. Have 4 AR-15s pointed at me. I didn't have any great love for the British police, Ms. Broomfield, the British troops. I didn't know what they were going to do, but I knew I was a Black man in Northern Ireland, and my wife could have gotten a letter saying that shit happens. I'm not here. I mean, my attitude on police as a whole is pretty much irrelevant. What is relevant, though, is I fear the police.
Mhm.
Even when my apartment years ago was broken into by someone and I called the police, even when they showed up, they're supposed to be there to help me, I still was in fear.
Mhm.
And so I shouldn't have been. And that's what I'm saying. That's what I hate. I should not have to have been in fear.
Right.
And it's because of the way that the system operates and that the system is not race neutral that we've got a big problem. The issue isn't about individual cops. The issue is to the extent to which an environment is created where law enforcement is able to get away with certain things, particularly, but not just, in certain communities. And it's got to stop.
Absolutely.
It simply has to stop. And it means that the union movement needs to take a stand on it and not be afraid to speak up, allegedly because that's somehow being anti-worker. It's not being anti-worker. It's saying we want justice. And any more than it is to say to a union that excluded Black workers that is a white supremacist union. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody in it is a white supremacist, but if there are no Black workers there, it's white supremacists. Let's not play a game. And if there are people that are being killed in the streets by rogue police, and if the police unions are not speaking up about that and are not saying, you know what, we realize that there really is a problem here, then they're part of the problem. Just as much as if you had a union where there was rampant sexual harassment, and the union said, hey, you know, we're here to defend our members. And if women keep coming forward and saying, but we're being sexually harassed, where is the union? What is the union saying about this? We say, no, we're not saying anything. We're defending our members. We want to make sure everyone has due process. Yeah, but what about the people that are being harassed? Do they have any rights? Should the union that is supposed to be speaking up for justice be defending them and saying, there is a problem in the system? Sure, we'll make sure that the due process, but damn it, we are not going to tolerate sexual harassment. And when we see it, we're going to kick your ass too.
I agree.
That's what I want to see the police unions say. Right? I want to see them come up and say, you know what, we're going to make sure, yeah, you're an officer, we'll defend you. Okay. But if we find out that you're pulling this shit off, we're going to go upside your head. And we, in fact, are going to join with people in the communities. And we're going to say that as police officers who are supposed to be serving the community, We're with you. We're not with rogue officers that are going to kill little kids for playing with plastic weapons. I mean, for God's sakes. Or killing Castillo, who had a license to carry a gun and notified the cop that he had a gun. And not even the NRA, which is supposed to be defending gun rights, would come out and say something was wrong.
Absolutely.
So that's where I stand on these things. And my attitude is that, as I said in the very beginning, maybe before you joined the call, that I'm in favor of police having unions. But sometimes I think, almost like when you have a bad marriage, that sometimes it's better to separate, because you realize you really can't live together in the same household. You can maybe be friends living in different homes. I get my apartment, she's got her apartment, and everything is cool because we realize we simply can't live together. And I think we have a situation where, precisely because most police unions don't believe in solidarity, truth be told, and because most police unions will not come out and say, we are against rogue behavior and we will take a stand against fascists, it just may be time to separate, that's all.
Okay, Colin, and then Jim.
So I guess I just have a sort of a comment, but I think it's Bill just said a lot of what I was thinking in a more articulate way than I'm gonna. But I think to me, it's not about all cops if it's not about all cops, right? Like, and I think we've gotten really used to this, like this piece that it's a few bad apples, and I think every time we say that, we forget the whole statement, right? The whole statement has always been a few bad apples spoils the bunch.
Right.
And the reasoning for that is because if you don't deal with the culture, if you don't excise problematic parts of culture, they rot from inside. And it sort of duplicates to me to me it there's a rough conversation I have when I hear due process here, because the issue isn't necessarily due process. The issue is the consistent, historically uneven application of due process, right? So we have 100 years of folks in Black and other communities telling us that there's a problem with police, and police saying, no, he came at me. He had a gun. No, and all of these reasons that a dozen witnesses will be like, that's not what happened. We saw it. Well, you don't have it on camera because we didn't have cameras for 150 years, right? Okay, now we got cameras, and then you run into the Rodney King situation. All right, now there's cameras. And I think a lot of people very excitedly were like, we caught him. We caught him. Look, it's on camera. And the supposed structure of due process let him walk. And I think now we're in a place where increasingly there's cameras everywhere. And the epidemic that white folks, I think, largely have been told existed for a long time and weren't necessarily ready to believe it, are seeing that, wow, when you put cameras everywhere, suddenly that epidemic is pretty in your face. And maybe if if that culture has gone on for 150 years of policing, 200 years of policing, is it at this point that the cultures of the institutions need some real deep rewiring, even if there are good individuals in there, even if there are a lot of good individuals in there? And to me, I think that the conversation is one where we often can't even, and this is the difficulty that I find, is that, from a number of times trying to have these sort of conversations in the Labor Council, we end up hitting a wall trying to have the conversation because there is the defensiveness of police. And I don't necessarily, I think I agree with Bill. I don't think we need to get rid of the conversation about due process. But if the way due process plays out is every time a Black man is accused of anything in the society, he ends up in jail for half his life. But every single time a cop is accused of anything, they walk. At some point, due process is obviously kind of bullshit. And so my hope is that what we're finding a way towards, and that the labor movement can find a way to participate in, is a real conversation about the equal application of due process. And I don't, I hope that we can start having a more productive conversation in labor about how to back that up, because the reason why we were created in the first place was because working people were being given a false or often completely fake version of due process to themselves, right? We wouldn't trust due process if HR was the one doing it. We created instruments and tools to ensure that we get due process for our working folks. That same but in different ways process, I think, applies here, and I hope we can figure out how to create those new mechanisms. And I don't know what they are exactly, but I hope we figure them out. I know that's not a question, and I hate when people do that, but I apologize for doing that.
That's okay. That's okay. We are bumping up on the 8 o'clock hour. It is 7:57. I want to give Bill the opportunity to respond to what Colin said. Jim, you got a minute after that?
Sure.
And then we'll need to close out and say our goodnights.
Well, I don't know how to respond to Colin, because I agree with him. So I don't really have anything to add. I want to, Shelley, I wanted to save a final comment until the last question.
Okay.
And then just sign out.
I'll try to be quick. One is a suggestion, and Brother Fletcher and Shelley, you've talked about it, and I'd be willing to work on the education committee. It's addressing not just union leadership, but members, and coming up with part of a union orientation. We've been doing it in my union for over 40 years. When they have the first day they're in the Postal Workers Union, they know that civil rights and workers' rights is the same struggle. They know more about Martin Luther King than as I Have a Dream speech. They know why he was in Memphis on April 4th, 68, and who A. Philip Randolph was. That needs to be included. The other thing about white privileges, and Bill mentioned, this is the first time we saw so many white people protesting for blacks and Black Lives Matter. Well, those of us, probably only Denise, is old enough like me to have been active in 1968. Sorry, Denise, I gave away your age. But this has been a horrific problem forever. The difference is today they've seen it on camera. That's the only difference today. The majority of the police unions in 1968, Nixon's law and order and his racist Southern strategy wasn't enough for the cops. Most of the cops unions endorsed George Wallace in 1968. So this is not a new problem, and we've got to educate our members to that fact. Last thing I'm going to say is there's a recommendation. I don't know when they're going to publicize it. I know people who worked on the race committee, and I liked it, and they asked me about it. It's stopping racist bullies before they're hired. Psychological profiles, lie detector tests. Let's try to weed out the racist bullies before they get on the police force, in addition to making the police look more like the communities they represent. So that's all. So I'll let Bill finish with his comments.
Oh, okay. Before Bill does that, Marvin, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I just wanted just to chime in and say, I read some of the comments, and hopefully you guys can hear me pretty good. I still got my mask on because I'm still inside the building.
Yeah.
Okay. Institutions have people that work within them. So when we talk about institutional racism, we can't look at it as just some building on a street with no face, and I think a lot of times we speak in generalizations like that, and we lose sight of the fact that there are people that were socially conditioned to think a certain way, to view people a certain way, and that bleeds over into those microaggressions and those biases that Bill talked about. And so when we talk about law enforcement, you don't right away see people of color like African Americans or Asian Americans or Latinos or Native Americans. You don't always see women, or you don't always see LGBTQ. The predominance of white males have been what law enforcement was in the early parts of this country. And when we look at them on TV and whatnot, and our different TV shows or movies, that is again the same predominant demographic. So we start to get an image in our head when we talk about law enforcement, and we don't necessarily see the other ethnic cultural groups out there. And so as much as some of us practice, I think, cognitive dissonance when we hear some of the stories, like some of us that have mentioned on the Zoom meeting tonight, you know, these smartphones have brought a validation to what people of color have said for over the years and years and generations in this country. And so our unions, our makeup of all of those different collective demographics, and the same struggles that we have in the mainstream culture, we also have within the police and the union culture. And it's gonna take a lot of effort on the good folk, as well as those who have challenges, to stand up, because it's not easy to stand up when you're the only person within an organization and point the finger, because now you are being ostracized and vilified for saying what's right. And it's a frightening thing. No one wants to be on that island alone. So I wanted to share that because I am a man of color. I served 25 years in law enforcement, 27 years in military. And there have been times where I've experienced racism. And it's not easy to palate, because you want to believe that when you're in that uniform, that you're embraced as one of the members in blue, or as a Marine in green. And so I just wanted to share that when we talk about what does it mean to be a supporter of anti-racism. Being good isn't always enough. Marching isn't always enough. Education is a big piece to that. And we gotta be able to teach ourselves about the different cultures and accept them and be embracing of them. And we also gotta make sure that we have representation at the union. If you don't have somebody that looks like the people you're fighting for, then you're not gonna know what issues to actually tackle. So I just want to share that, and hopefully that has added some different perspective on what it is for a person of color to be part of an organization and not always see themselves as a part of that organization.
Thank you, Marvin. Okay, last words for you, Bill.
Yeah, so I just want to thank you all for inviting me to participate in this. I really appreciated the comments, even when we didn't agree. I really appreciate that and appreciate the mutual respect that was going on. One of the critical things that we've got to understand is that what the union movement does, more than what it says, is what we're going to be judged based upon. And so to the extent to which we're a movement that is seen as advancing consistent justice, we will be viewed one way. To the extent to which we're viewed as a movement that says certain things, but either does nothing or does the opposite, we get viewed in a different way. And so the challenge when we're dealing with this issue of law enforcement comes back to what I keep saying. What is our vision of law enforcement? What is it that we want from law enforcement in a democratic society? And that's what we need to be fighting for. And that means that we need to be completely unafraid of taking on these issues of racial injustice. That's our challenge. And that may lose some people some votes in union elections, but I don't see the options. So I want to again, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here, for challenging us, for expanding our horizons, for helping us to see things in different ways, and for giving us lots to think about and lots to talk about.